Keller.
that this ceremony that I witnessed, the joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony, actually left one with a sense of hope. That because it's not the politicians who are going to resolve the conflict; it's the people. And just to, I think if anybody can, I don't know if it was recorded, but if you have a chance to take a look at it, I think you'll find it equally moving.
If you can find a recording somewhere, let us know.
Okay, I'll let you know. I mean, look online, Joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Ceremony.
If such things happen again, let us know.
Okay.
But it happens every year. I usually go in person.
Year. Yeah.
I usually go in person, Chaim, but I completely missed it. I missed it, the vote this year, so I'm a little bummed if you can hear about a recording.
It was unbelievable, unbelievable. I never thought I would be so
You saw it, Fred, yeah.
Yeah, it was just astonishing.
All right, so I want to begin by posing a question, actually quoting Art Green, who's posing a question. This is a column that he wrote years ago. Some of you know Arthur Green is a professor of Jewish thought, Hasidism, and Jewish mysticism, founder of the rabbinical school in Boston at Hebrew College, a student of Heschel's, and who's written numerous books and so on. So Art, years ago, wrote a column entitled Finding God in an Israel That Isn't Zion. And what he means is finding God in an Israel that's not the Messianic promise, the fulfillment of the Messianic promise. It's a normal country. And he writes as follows, so I'll quote a little bit from the column. He says, "The building of a free Jewish society in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, has been the great collective undertaking of the Jewish people in the 20th century. As such, it deserves to be the object, indeed one of the central objects, of theological reflection. A Jewish theology that stands aloof from Zionism denies the Jewish people the right to set its own agenda and to reorder its priorities. Where does such a view lead us? Surely it need not embrace the shallow triumphalism of the post-67 chief of cabinet or the dangerous false messianism of Gush Emunim. Those of us who are theologically unorthodox, it simply means this: the return of the Jewish people to its land in our century, or the last century, is one of those events in which we must seek out elements of religious meaning. We do not believe that God gave us the land or the victory over the Arabs any more than we believe that God is responsible for the Holocaust or the Exodus, for that matter. The Exodus was a transforming event in the history of Israel, one preserved in mythic guise and remaining central to the religious lives of all later generations of Jews. It is an event in which Jews seek meaning, in which even we unorthodox, he says, about the of us who identify that way, find traces of divinity. Can we say less of the return to Zionism in our own time? So in other words, it's not the event that necessarily is a religious event, the founding of Israel, but the existence of Israel, the fact that somehow we were able to return and accomplish what was done, requires us to try to find some meaning that says something to the Jewish people. That's number one. Number two, he says the following, equally important: an acceptance of the religious meaningfulness of the return to Zion is also crucial for another reason. It provides a stance from which to engage in Jewish criticism of the state and its actions. If the state of Israel is religiously neutral, the arms merchants who work more or less in concert with its Department of Defense are simply Jews engaged in a dirty business as a way of making a living. They are hardly the first and surely not the last. But if the existence of this experiment in the renewal of Jewish statehood does have something sacred and spiritually precious about it, as I believe it does, the arms merchants are betrayers of our dream. So in other words, the attempt to find some spiritual religious significance to the state of Israel also gives a frame through which we can express our criticism against an ideal that we have, that we think a state of Israel should adhere to. So this is the framework that I wanted to sort of set for our discussion. And given the time limits, this is my goal, hopefully. I want to relate to you a variety of different religious positions. And I'll list them as follows. What I call religious anti-Zionism, right, that sees in Zionism actually a traitorous, heretical movement. Number two, the opposite extreme, religious Messianic Zionism, what I would call mystical Zionists, actually leading to a type of political Messianism. And in that context, I'll discuss the prayer for the state of Israel. Third variety, halachic religious Zionism, or as David Hartman calls it, covenantal Zionism. And number four, agnostic religious Zionism, if you can say that, Zionism a la Yeshayahu Leibovitz, and I will claim also the founder of religious Zionism. We'll talk about that. And finally, I'm most interested in actually finding the time to say a few words about what I call secular religious Zionism. It sounds like a what do you call it? What's the word I'm looking for?
An oxymoron?
An oxymoron. Sounds like an oxymoron, but which I think is a very interesting force that I think has emerged in Israel today, and one that in some ways is uniquely Israeli, and importantly so. All right. Let me begin with the first variety, anti-Zionism. Now, anti-Zionism, religious anti-Zionism, is largely grounded in a worldview and uses a particular source as its primary proof text, and that's in the supplemental sheet, the last two sheets of the handout. The first source in the supplement, if whoever's controlling the sources there, if you have to move all the way to the end. Can someone do? Am I doing that? Yeah, just go all the way to the end, and pay the next to last page, page before that, on the top right-hand corner. Okay. All right, I'll read. It's a Talmudic passage. Some of you are familiar with it. Reb Zera says, it's a Gemara in Ketuvot. Those of you who are Talmudically inclined, you should look at the pages 110b and 111a in Ketubot regarding the centrality and the holiness of the land of Israel. Reb Zera says, that verse is needed for the statement by Rabbi Yosef Reb Chanina. Rabbi Yosef Reb Chanina said, there are in fact 3 verses repeating the oath. There's a whole discussion which centers around Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you're forbidden to leave Babylonia to go to live in Eretz Yisrael, and he finds a verse. The Reb Zera then responds that verse is needed for something else. So then the Gemara says, well, no, we have these other verses. For Rabbi Yosef, Reb Chanina said, there are in fact 3 verses repeating the oath. I adjure you. Hishbati etchem, in Song of Songs, 3 times it says Hishbati etchem, I cause you to swear. And what are the oaths? And what is the purpose of these 3 oaths? 1, that Israel should not go up to Eretz Yisrael with force. All right, so there means that the people of Israel were forced to take an oath by God that they would not use military force to conquer the land, as long as the land was occupied by another people. The second, that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured Israel that they should not rebel against the nations. Okay. And the third, so not only that we wouldn't take up arms, but there would be no rebellion against the nations of the world. And third, that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured the nations that they should not oppress Israel too much. Now, the religious Zionists who are confronted with this text and these oaths, I'll say a few words about the oaths. I don't want to spend a lot of time. They usually respond, well, one of the responses is, you see, the nations of the world were also compelled to take an oath. They violated their oath, so therefore we're no longer held to our oath. They beat us up, and therefore we have the right to conquer the land. Okay. Now, of course, this is not a halachic, a legal discussion in the Talmud. It's homiletic, and everybody understands it that way. And it's unclear to me, I mean, it's still a question. It's unclear to me that these oaths played any significant role in the course of Jewish interpretive history. I may be wrong. In other words, yes, it is quoted. I'm not sure that it's the determining characteristic. There's something much more significant that's at stake here that has nothing to do with oaths. It's something that they represent. And the idea of the oaths is that during the course of our exile, the Jews were relegated to passivity, historical and political passivity. In other words, part of the whole exilic experience and the fact that we were exiled, we were sent out from our land, meant that our fate was that we were no longer actors on the historical stage, because the primary actor, I mean, this was the lesson that we had to learn. God is the only actor, the only historical actor as far as Judaism is concerned. The Jews are merely the vehicle, a passive group that's acted upon, that reacts to. We don't initiate. We are not initiators. We don't take political responsibility. And in fact, this was the outlook, or the traditional Jewish outlook over the centuries, that Zionism rejected. We're going to come to that in a moment. In other words, this was what Zionism had to confront. It wasn't a verse, and it wasn't an oath. I mean, you understand, that's not what Zionism had to deal with. Zionism had to confront a worldview that said Jews should not get involved. Now, let me sort of tweak that a little bit in terms to give it some sort of moral valence. The most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most elevating understanding of that notion that we were relegated to passivity was that as a result of that passivity, we Jews would not bloody our hands in the political misbehaviors of all the nations of the world throughout history. And that our passivity guaranteed a certain type of morality. The price for our suffering was that we were able to embrace ideals and not have to sully our ideals in any way. And the rabbis, consciously or unconsciously, I mean, I don't know, how much of, I'm not aware of, there are better historians who may be around here on this call who know more than I, whether there was a consciousness during the course of Jewish history about what the cost of this passivity was. Usually, the Jewish response was there was no option. There was no option for Jews to initiate. We were always subjects, and we were always a minority, and we never took it upon ourselves to assume any responsibility or any power, for that matter. But in the absence of power, we were able to abstain from all the bloodletting throughout history, and that crafted, that shaped a moral personality that is central to the sense of who a Jew is. Yeah, so that entering the 20th century and entering the age of nationalism, what we had to deal with was this question: if we're now going to step out of our role and embrace nationalism and initiate our own sort of historical participation, can we still maintain our character that we've nurtured throughout our history? Or, by the way, in a cynical way, we could say the price of nurturing that character throughout our history was too costly. Now it's time for us to grow up and behave like everybody else. And it doesn't matter what our tradition had to say. Now we are a nation. And we can say a bracha she'echiyanu because we can do all the crimes that everybody else can commit without feeling too guilty, right? I mean, let's get rid of that. So this is the background against which the battle of religion and Zionism would be fought, right? So let's see what they had to say. So first, I'm going to read you a source that's not in your sheets. There are collections of letters that were written by the great rabbis of Eastern Europe at the turn of the century. One of the collections was edited in Warsaw in 1900. There's a book that was published later on, which translates some of the letters that were actually written a few years later, because there was a problem for the anti-religious Zionists, and that is in 1902, a religious Zionist movement was founded called the Mizrahi. And we're going to get to that. So that became a primary sort of thorn in the side of the anti-religious, the anti-Zionist religionists who had to contend not only with secular Zionists, but with sinful colleagues who were some of them their friends, who embraced Zionism. Real problem. So now, among the letters, by the way, that were written were really by important sages, some of whose names you would recognize, like Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, the grandfather of my teacher, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. He condemned Zionism. In fact, there's a famous story about how when Herzl died, Rabbi Chaim had a deal with a Gabbai. The Gabbai in Brisk, that was the town where he was rabbi, was Menachem Begin's father. And the deal was that Rabbi Chaim had the keys to the shul. So the day that Herzl died, Rabbi Chaim locked the shul because he heard that the community was going to be gathering for a eulogy in memory of Herzl. And Rabbi Chaim was an adamant anti-Herzlian. And what happened was that when Begin's father came to the locked synagogue, he broke the lock and opened the door, and he figured for this he was going to violate the arrangement that he had with Reb Chaim. Apparently, some time later, after Begin's father and Reb Chaim met, it was clear that Reb Chaim had sort of forgiven him for breaking the lock, and Begin's father sort of was curious as to what had changed. And apparently what had changed was that Reb Chaim said, "I saw that the people were all with you." That's very interesting. That's exactly what the Jewish attitude or the Jewish approach, you might call it a sociological approach, how it should be, and it's how a good halachis, a good person who's making decisions for the community, how they should act. So Reb Chaim understood that because when the lock was broken, the synagogue was overrun, meaning it was packed to the gills with people in the community who had come to commemorate and to memorialize Herzl. Now, one of Reb Chaim's colleagues was a man named Reb Meir Simcha of Devinsk, but it wasn't only these obscure rabbis who you might not know, but the Lubavitcher. The Lubavitcher was an adamant anti-Zionist. You might have read last week that the Lubavitch woman in Mumbai, who was chosen to light the torch, in the Torch of Independence in Israel, pulled out. And one of the explanations was that Chabad Central opposed her participation in the ceremony. The veneer of safety was used, that it's not proper to fly and so on and so forth, but she wanted to go, and the Chabad Central forbade her. And it seems as if this is sort of the remnant of their official anti-Zionism. Now, Chabad's very complicated because they're anti-Zionists who are adamantly extreme in their pro-Israelness. So that gives you a sense about how Zionism and pro-Israel can be decoupled. And even that's not the same. And it's complicated in that regard. All right, so just to listen to the language of Rabbi Simcha. The Lord doth roar from on high, and from his holy habitation gives forth his voice. For there have arisen new rebels and traitors, thinking to lay the foundation of Zion and to establish a kingdom. And they have raised the standard to gather our exile, in the promise that in their future they will put an end to all the trouble and calamity, and that they, the Zionists, will deliver Israel from all its troubles. I cannot utter with my lips, nor put down in writing that which is in my heart concerning these unstable men. We ask ourselves, what have these unbelievers heard that they have come forth? Who called them, and what do they want with us? They talk of redeeming us from exile, while we do not desire redemption at the hands of man, seeing that we know that its end is, heaven forbid, destruction and vanity. And all this comes upon them through the desire for greatness and power that burns and consumes their hearts like fire. I mean, he goes on and mentions Herzl and so on, and it's a very strong denunciation. Now, in your sources, you have a number of examples of anti-religious, of anti-Zionist religion. So the first source that you have by Breuer, which is a much more moderate source, because Breuer did go to live in Israel. He was not a Zionist, meaning he wasn't an official part of the Zionist enterprise, even though he supported the settlement in Israel. But he wanted to be done in a religious way. So if you look at the second paragraph of source 1a, Breuer, who came from Germany, he was the follower of, let's say, the tradition of Samson Raphael Hirsch, writes as follows: but the Zionists are strange. Their ancestors were loyal to the Torah, but you can see how Zionist culture has shaped their character. They denied their tradition, which lay in their hearts. They rejected spirituality, which they believed had damaged the nation. With a zealous love, they became one with the land in order to plant a new generation that is healthy and strong, solid as steel, with their head in the real world and their roots in the ground, but their back turned from God. The Zionist nation, in this zealous devotion to the land, they formed the basis for a new nation, an Eretz Yisraeli nation. Maybe they would develop a new culture on the basis of the farming experience, but it won't be the Jewish people anymore. It won't be a Jewish culture anymore, because the national homeland would be the end of the Jewish people. Now, what is true, and where Breuer is right, and to that extent, Rabbi Simcha, I mean the others, is that the Zionist theory in a foundational way, engaged in an outright rebellion against Judaism. I think you need to know that. Anybody who is sort of, engaged with Israel, you should know that in truth, Israel happened. In other words, the state emerged only because there was initially a group of people who were adamant in their effort and their effort to undermine the structural basis of the Judaism, the Jewish worldview that had existed for centuries, actually for millennia. So it was a battle against the foundational principles of the Judaism that had been lived for 2,000 years. One that said, we depend upon God. We are waiting. Achak elo. In other words, that's the theme. We are waiting. God is the actor. We are the ones who benefit from God's actions. We're not the actors on the stage. This was the height of arrogance to reject this notion. The most extreme formulation of the anti-religious, anti-Zionist religious position is one that's articulated by the Satmar and his ilk, the Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. That's source 1b. It's only in Hebrew. I'll read you a little bit in the Hebrew and translate and tell you what the rest says. Klalo shel davar. This is from a work of his called Vayoel Moshe. I mean, there's a basic work that he wrote called Al Hagulav Al Atmura, where he really deals with the 3 O's, and he develops a very learned exposition about the evils of Zionism. Halo shel davar, in principle, matter and principle is milvad avon hachamur shel ha'avara al hashvua. Apart from the very serious and severe violation of the oath, od tim'u et Beit Yisrael, they polluted the house of Israel, bitum'at haminut v'hakfira, with the impurity of heresy and traitorous heresy. Rachamana litzlan, God save us. Ve'ein timan, it's no wonder, ma shehaya hacharon ha'av hagadol hazeh v'yatza haketzef milifnei Hashem. It's no wonder that there was this great anger, the anger, consuming anger that emerged from God in response to the Zionists. What's the Satmar Rebbe referring to?
The Shoah.
The Shoah. All right? So I want you to see this. This is the most extreme form of religious anti-Zionism. The Zionists caused the Holocaust. They forced God, because they rejected God's hand in history, they forced God to reject the Jewish people and to punish them in the most severe way. That's, of course, in the deterministic scheme of religious history that had been traditional. And the Satmar Rebbe not only accuses the Zionists sort of unleashing God's anger, but he accuses them of, through their criminal behavior, that they actually motivated anti-Jewish anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish actions on the part of the Nazis, and brought about the destruction of the Jewish people. That they actually understood that, in fact, part of their whole devious scheme was to participate, in a way, in the destruction of European Jewry, so as to potentiate the creation of a Jewish community in the land of Israel. The Zionists were willing to sacrifice the Jews of Europe in order to be able to create a state of Israel. Now, as you might sometimes read these sort of things written by anti-Zionist propagandists, but I think it's important to know whether the anti-Zionist propagandists are aware of it or not. Usually they are, because there's someone who's always, reporting to them on the internal stuff, that we have rabbis who say these obscene, it's not horrible, it's obscene to assert that God brought about the Holocaust as a punishment for Zionism. And that we actually, unfortunately, that there are people who embrace that point of view. Now, against this religious rejection, any questions up till now? Any questions? Okay. Against this extreme religious view, I want to present what I call another extreme view, and that is the view of Messianic redemption. We have it articulated in a number of sources that I'm going to share with you. So 2b by Rav Kook. So let's read the last paragraph here in English. Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Palestine. He was appointed in 1919. He was given the appointment. He came to Jerusalem in 1920. He had been in Yafo. He was himself a yeshiva student who studied at the legendary Volozhin Yeshiva, was the favorite student there of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Many of you have heard me talk about the Nitziv. The Nitziv was a type of proto-Zionist. He supported Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion. In the yeshiva in Volozhin, there was an active group of students who were members of this proto-Zionist religious movement. in the yeshiva of Lithuania. So Rav Kook writes as follows: the state is not the ultimate happiness of man. This you can say regarding regular states, states whose goals aspire to no more than national responsibility. But this is not true for a state that is essentially an ideal, that carves into its very essence the highest ideal content, which is the truest, highest happiness of every individual. This state is truly the highest rung on the ladder of the pursuit of happiness. And this state is our state, the state of Israel, the foundation of the throne of the God in the world, that all her desire is that God will be one and God's name one, which is truly the utmost level of happiness. Now, there are those who think that this is one of the earliest uses of the term state. It's in the early part of the 20th century when Rabbi Kook wrote this. He died in 1905. And it's clear that, you know, this is a conversation. Think about the conversation with the Satmar. The Satmar says that the state is the downfall of Judaism. It's an act against God. And Rav Kook says the state itself is the embodiment of God in the world. I mean, think about that. The state is true. It's the highest rung. There's a type of mystical romance in the nature in which he presents. The Jews refrained from engaging in any national work, in any national politics throughout their history until the right moment was reached, which is now is the Messianic moment that has arrived. And in the Messianic moment, which is an engagement that's sort of in God's time, the state takes on a new character entirely, no longer merely a mechanism, but a sort of a framework for God's presence in the world. So you can understand why this notion is both, I would say on the one hand, I think it's inspiring. It's inspiring. On the other hand, it's extremely dangerous because it grants ultimacy to a state. Because after all, what Rav Kook got wrong was that the state of Israel was not going to be a messianic, a state that sort of was the instantiation of God, God's presence. It was going to be a state like other states. So therefore, it was failed in terms of his definition. He wrote further on in one of his classic works, or wrote the following, which is really important because it's the first entry in this collection. He writes as follows: Eretz Yisrael is not something external to the Jewish people, a necessary framework of communal life and a basis of material or even spiritual existence. By the way, this is Rav Kook criticizing normative Zionism. This is what he said: Eretz Yisrael has an intrinsic value, vitally associated with the Jewish genius, activating the Jewish soul in its inner recesses. The sanctity and attraction of Eretz Yisrael cannot be accounted for in mere rationalist, humanist terms. In other words, the state of Israel is not about promoting Jewish identity. It's not about giving Jews a national home. It's not about that at all. Rather, ought we consider it in the light of the divine spirit resting on Israel as a whole and its imprint on the Jewish character. What is the state of Israel? Give me another word for the divine imprint. Resting. What's the divine imprint resting on the state of Israel? What's the Hebrew term that you would use? Anyone?
Shekhinah.
Shekhinah.
Are you looking for
right?
Tzelem?
This is the Shekhinah, actually, that God's presence is in the land of Israel. The alien idea regarding Eretz Israel is a mere instrument of national survival. I mean, this is the critique of Zionism. Fortifying Jewish existence, Jewish identity, religious faith and practice in the diaspora will not yield lasting fruit, since it disregards the sacred character of Eretz Yisrael, which is objectively, its holiness personified. The effective regeneration of diaspora Jewry depends solely upon the degree of its involvement in Eretz Yisrael. Only the hope generated by this land is capable of infusing life into Jewish existence. Thus, diaspora Judaism is a function of the prospect of salvation, whereas Jewish Eretz Yisrael denotes salvation itself. All right, the Hebrew for the last line, which is fantastic, is V'hayahadut shel Eretz Yisrael hi hayishua atzma. The Judaism of the land of Israel is redemption itself, salvation itself. It's an amazingly sort of exaggerated claim. Now, this exaggerated claim is what informs, it seems to me, the prayer for the state of Israel. Source number 3 on your sheets, page number 6. First line of the prayer, right? Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, Sur Yisrael Goalo, the Rock of Israel, the Redeemer of Israel. Barechet Medinat Yisrael. Bless the state of Israel. Reshit Simichat Geulatenu. The first flowering of our redemption. So the language, there's an attempt here to dance around with the language, so that the term, the first flowering, was used. Rabbi Riskin, who tries to be careful, says shetahei, that it should become. But there's no doubt in my mind that the authors of this prayer intended there to be a messianic consciousness in the creation of the state of Israel. It may be that Rabbi Herzog, who was the chief rabbi when the state of Israel was declared, did not hold Rabbi Kook's point of view. However, what happened is that he fell into the language, into the framework, into the Cookian framework, and allowed himself to identify a political enterprise as a messianic fulfillment, or as the beginning of the messianic fulfillment, which I consider to be a violation. In other words, it's a state. And he pushed the idea to the religious extreme, at least to the margins of the extreme. He's not Rabbi Kook, but he used the Cookian terminology, and therefore seeded religious Zionism all over the world with this consciousness that religious engagement with Israel is messianic, and the state of Israel is a vehicle, or is the expression of the messianic enterprise itself. And the dangers, one of the dangers of this is that when you think, or when you imagine that you have entered a messianic age, you have sort of penetrated into God's time, right? Redemption, not history. It's not history. It's redemption beyond history. And in God's time, there's no normal causality. Therefore, humans don't have to take responsibility for what they do, because God is there. Example, let me give you an example of what I mean, because it's an extreme example. When the Temple Mount plot was uncovered in the late 80s, a group of Jews who wanted to blow up the mosque on the Temple Mount, they were asked, what do you think would have happened on the day after if you succeeded in blowing up the mosque? All the Arab nations would gather in war against Israel, and there would be a potential world war that would result. And their answer was as follows: Ein hachinami. Indeed, that's what would happen, right? And God would be forced to show his hand. We are now players in God's stage. That's exactly what the Satmar Rebbe warned against. Human beings cannot play in God's stage. The state of Israel, therefore, at least as I'm concerned, cannot be understood to be some enterprise that's working in God's framework. It's a human enterprise with all the flaws of human enterprise and all the potential that humans bring to the project. Okay, so there's a direct link between that language and the language in the language of Rav Kook and the language in the prayer. And it's not an accident, by the way, it's in your sheets here, that the British have a different, Rabbi Brodie, who was then the chief rabbi in Great Britain and the Commonwealth, formulated another prayer and didn't include the beginning, Reshit Michat Gulatenu. That's source number 4. And he's not the only one. In other words, this is an ongoing debate within religious circles. Was the inclusion of the first flowering of our redemption dangerous? Was it dangerous? Because it not only is an expression of Messianism, it somehow is an inspiration to understand Israel in Messianic terms and all that that entails and what it justifies. Now, the most extreme and more extreme formulation, which has political overtones of Rabbi Kook's notion that the Shekhinah, the state of Israel, somehow embodies the Shekhinah. Before, by the way, Rav Kook died in 1935, so before there was a state. The more extreme version was articulated by his son, whom I don't call only a Messianic Zionist, but a political Messianist. He writes in source number 2D, people speak of the beginning of redemption, right? He's not satisfied. We are in the parlor, not in the vestibule, right? We're right at the edge. The return to Zion, the kingdom of Israel being rebuilt anew. It's happening right now. This is the revelation of the kingdom of heaven. The Israel, then listen to this. See, this is what happens. Gets out of hand. The Israel Defense Force is total sanctity. Now, give me a break. I'm sorry to say that. I say it that way because it's serious. I mean, you know, that is pure incitement. The Israel Defense Force is total sanctity. It represents the rule of the people of the land in God's land. We must know, and then he goes on to say, by the way, that the uniforms are holy, the tanks are holy. You must know that the kingdom of heaven is being, even in the kingdom of Ben Gurion. And I mean, there are many extreme statements that were made by Tzvi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook. He was the spiritual leader and inspiration for Gush Emunim, for the settlers on the West Bank, and their ideology. Their ideology emanates from his teachings and formulations that students made subsequently. Very interesting and important theology to see, because it's a contemporary Jewish theology that may be all wrong, but it's you know, there's a whole school that it's generated. Now, what Tzvi Yehuda writes, I have a collection of his teachings, which is so striking to me, is as follows. His father I think it was 1919, 1920, when, I forget when it was. No, it was earlier. His father allowed, during the sabbatical year, his father allowed the sale of property to an Arab. Now, the question is, how can someone who believes that, first of all, that the commandments that coming to the land of Israel gives us the possibility of fulfilling the commandments, how can they abandon and annul the commandment to observe the sabbatical year? It's an opportunity to do so. So Rabbi Kook's reasoning in his work Shabbat Haaretz is that by annulling the sabbatical for this 1 year, it will facilitate the performance or the fulfillment of the sabbatical in years to come. That's at least part of the surface reasoning. Tzvi Yehuda goes beyond, and you see it in Rav Kook's writings itself. And he presents actually a halachic argument for this point. He says we make a mistake in our understanding. The laws, the mitzvot are not subsequent to the land, because the mitzvot of the particular mitzvot, the commandments like sabbatical, are called mitzvot hateluyot ba'aretz. They're dependent on the land. So the supreme religious idea and value is the land. The mitzvot are only subsequent to the supreme value. So the reason that Rabbi Kook could annul the fulfillment of the sabbatical for the sake of the farmers so that they could farm the land is that the value of farming the land and holding the territory is a supreme value in Judaism, and mitzvot are a secondary value. Nobody else says this. Nobody dares to say this. All right? So he says, and he uses the language that he uses is where's it here? There, because the land is holy in and of itself, mitzad ha'inyan ha'eloki sheba, because of the divine element that's within it. That phrase, inyan ha'eloki, that's a direct quote from mystical sources. That notion that the land embodies a divine element. It's striking. It's striking in its extremism. Okay, so that's one side. Rav Kook, Rav Yehuda, and the Gush Emunim. Any questions? Jerome, I can't hear you.
Unmute. Yeah, I see in your sources, just briefly, that you don't.
Louder, please.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, just briefly. One is that you don't have Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who addresses.
I do. We're coming to Yeshayahu Leibowitz.
Okay, because he addresses it specifically.
Yeah, don't worry, we're coming to that.
All right. The other question is, from Rav Kook's perspective, isn't it traditional that the Shekhinah is also in Gola? How can the Shekhinah be there if it's also in Gola?
All right, well, that's what we're doing. We are actively bringing the Shekhinah back from exile into the land. I mean,
this is Joshua de la Reina. This is prime arrogance. This is religious perspective.
All right. I mean, this is what his messianism is. Okay. Now, I was going to read with you, but we don't have the time. The second source on the supplement comes from an article by in Mosaic, which is an online journal published by Tikva. Just because I wanted to give you an example, it's just outtakes from an article that's called Message from Jerusalem by Eric Cohn, who's the director of the whole project of the Tikva Foundation, to read a contemporary version of Cookism as it's presented as a type of Zionism. And that notion, I mean, I don't want you to, I know that the formulation sounds extreme, that God dwells in the land. Hanan Porat, who was a member of Knesset, once told David Hartman, how could you ever imagine that you want to compromise and return the land to the Palestinians? It would be like cutting up God's body. So, I mean, no, that's a sort of extreme discourse. But the fact is that the notions that the land is itself holy and the holiness inheres in the land, right? And that we are specially granted as the Jewish people, we have a special relationship to it, and the holiness is something sort of palatable in this regard. That's something that actually is in the minds of many Jews, including, by the way, secular Jews, who think of us as being special. We're special, the land is special, it's an endowment, sort of God's endowment. And we have to be careful with that in terms of how we articulate that. All right. Now, on the other side, what I would call the more realistic forms of religious Zionism, I'd like to turn now to my teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik. All right. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a conversation that you don't have the document. It's in a collection of conversations that students had with him. So they were asking him questions about assimilation and going to live in Israel and Yom HaAtzmaut. And in the course of the conversation, he says the following. So listen here. The land is very important. I emphasize that it is not the highest good we have in our hierarchy of values. Axiologically, it is not the highest good. The highest good in our hierarchy of values is one, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, and our special relationship we have to God, which expresses itself in observance, a unique morality, and a unique and singular way of life. This is the highest value, not the state. Remember that in Rav Kook, the state is the highest value and the mitzvot are secondary. Soloveitchik says it has never been. The highest value is the Torah and our specific relationship to God, which the Torah then requires of us. There is no doubt about it. Judaism does not revolve about the state. It revolves about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the divine. Then he says, he's asked, is there any validity to establishing the state as far as redemption? So he says, no Yemei HaMashiach, no days of the Messiah, no. Since it contributed greatly to the survival of our people, it is very important. This itself is important, the idea of the Messiah. But But all this language about redemption and the state, this is stupidity. I am against it. All right, so I don't think it could be any more explicit. Now, what does Rabbi Soloveitchik say? Look on source number 3 on your sheets, because it's wonderful to see the retort to Rav Kook. He writes as follows, source number 3 on the supplement. For Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ramban, the attribute of Kedusha, holiness, ascribed to the land of Israel is an objective metaphysical quality inherent in the land. With all my respect for the Rishonim, for these early sages, early medieval sages, I must disagree with such an opinion. I do not believe that it is halachically, legally cogent. Kedusha, holiness, under a halachic aspect, is man-made. More accurately, it is a historical category. So important. Rav Kook's thinking is trans-historical. It attempts to drive us into a metaphysical universe, into the divine universe. I called it romantic. It's the worst form of romanticism because you have the sense of the absolute value of that you're engaged with godly activities. Soloveitchik grabs us by the neck and says, you're human beings, stay in history. Jewish law is about contingency. It's about behavior in this world. Don't lose yourself in this sort of the drunkenness, in the fervor, in the ecstasy of the Cookian ways of thinking that somehow that you've entered into the divine realm when your feet are planted on earth and when you have to deal with other human beings and when morality is at stake. Of course, you're going to lose it all, he says. Remember, you're a historical being. Halacha grounds you in history. I can't say this enough. The great Jewish contribution to religion, one of the great Jewish contributions, is Jewish law, because it maintains sobriety. Judaism is not about prophecy. It's not about ecstasy, even though there are ecstatic movements and there's ecstatic experience. I'm not opposed to spiritual experience, but that doesn't carry with it the distinctive flavor of Judaism. It's an expression and a fulfilling one at that of Jewish life. But essentially, Judaism is a religion that attempted to ground people in normalcy and teach them how to be human beings. First of all, stop trying to be godly when you're not human yet. I mean, that's the primary. That's what Soloveitchik's saying. A soil is sanctified by historical deeds. In other words, we're saying sanctity is an instrument that humans have. If you behave in a holy way in the land, then you'll make it a holy place. If you behave immorally in the land, you're going to desecrate the land. Rav Kook says, no, the land is holy by definition. Just going to live there makes you holy. Nonsense, says Rabbi Soloveitchik. A soil is sanctified by historical deeds performed by a sacred people, never by any primordial superiority. The halachic term kedushat haaretz, the sanctity of the land, denotes the consequence of a human act, either conquest or the mere presence of the people on the land. Kedusha is identical with man's association with Mother Earth. Nothing should be attributed a priori to dead matter. Objective Kedusha smacks of fetishism, idolatry. Now, in our sheets, turn to David Hartman, all right? Because he says it, he actually, there's something, it's a little unclear in that Soloveitchik passage, I think. Hartman sort of spells it out rather beautifully. Source number 7. Hartman writes as follows. Religious Zionism does not need to treat the rise of Israel as a divine ruse on the way toward realizing the Messianic kingdom. There is an alternative perspective from which one can religiously embrace the secular Zionist invitation to return to the land, namely, the observation that Israel expands the possible range of halachic involvement in human affairs beyond the circumscribed borders of home and synagogue to the public domain. Jews in Israel are given the opportunity to bring economic, social, and political issues into the center of their religious consciousness. In other words, the state of Israel, creating the state of Israel, allowed Jews to enter the stage of history where being Jewish imposed upon us social, political, communal, and international responsibilities, something that for 2,000 years we never had and we never tasted. It also let us look at other religions from the perspective of being one, a colleague of other religions. We have a ground out of which we emerge. We're no longer simply the one to be pitied, the soul, the suffering soul to be pitied. We have a life. We've regained our life, and in regaining our life, we've entered the stage of history. And entering the stage of history, we now have responsibilities. That's what Hartman is talking about. That's why that discussion earlier that where I read you about arms merchants is relevant, because in the state of Israel, in Hartman's terminology, becomes a test. The test is, does Judaism work when push comes to shove? We all went to Hebrew school where they told you, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, that Judaism is about justice. Now let's see if when the Jews are in charge of their own land, whether they can do what they were taught when they were not in charge of anything except their own community. Does it work? Does Torah work? Does it live? I mean, in other words, that's the religious perspective that Hartman brings to our discussion, to the discussion of the religious meaning in the state of Israel. It's an opportunity for us to see, what the potential. Now, Jonathan Sachs formulated in the following way. He said there were two stages to Zionism. The first stage of Zionism was to create a state. The second stage to Zionism was to create a model, a moral nation. And he says the first stage has been fulfilled. The second stage is what we're engaged in now. All right? Or he says we're just beginning. We're limping into this second stage. Nevertheless, I think it's still on our consciousness. That's what keeps us going, that there's still a sense of fulfillment, and we're not ready to abandon the project and say it's all lost, right? Because we somehow, there's justice in Judaism, there are principles in Judaism that can be active, that can be generative, and we have many examples of this. Okay, today's ceremony that I mentioned at the beginning is an example of this type of humanism that emerges in a society where conquest is not seen to be the highest value at all, and the land is not the highest value. And sharing the land becomes a possibility. Understanding that responsibility, that's a mature perspective on who you are as a sovereign. Now, this is not the only religious perspective. Any questions on this Soloveitchik-Hartman axis? So,
A comment.
yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, my father, when he was middle-aged, made...
Who's this?
Sheldon K.
Sheldon, yeah, you go ahead.
Yes. When my father was middle-aged, he and my mom made Aliyah to Israel, principally because they wanted to be able to live the rhythms of being Jewish, the only place where they could truly, in an unfettered way, practice Judaism. So although redemption may not be the exact right word, but in a certain sense, there is something about having a place where Jews can be Jews,
right,
without fear of consequence.
I'm going to come to that, Sheldon.
Okay.
But I think you're absolutely right. There's a cultural national. It's what it means to have a sense of a nation. You have a language, you have a way of life, and you have a calendar, and the calendar is your calendar. That's exactly right. But the question is, of course, do other people have to pay for the right you have to have a calendar? And what's your responsibility to other people? That's why the Hartman perspective is important, because it introduces a sense of moral responsibility. It's not only about our own fulfillment. In other words, we decided to enter the stage of history. Entering the stage of history means interacting with others. It was no longer, if we wanted to be in a ghetto, that was what we had for we had that option. What we did was we shattered that option and we said we want to live in the world. I mean, that's what Zionism, that's how I understand Zionism. The problem is that there are Zionist leaders today who think that the best Israel is a ghetto. And there are, a lot of Jews who think that way. And they don't understand the implications of Zionism that have pushed us out in a very positive way, that we're not only thinking about the edge of our noses. Okay. Now, the most cynical of all theoreticians, and maybe the most realistic, is Yeshayahu Leibovitz. And you have one of his sources. Leibovitz was a contentious character, brilliant man, a professor of chemistry at the Hebrew University, born in Riga. A lot of his Jewish education, he's autodidact, has vast Jewish education. When he retired from his position as a professor of chemistry, he taught Maimonides, he taught philosophy and Kant at the Hebrew University. So a very, a really sort of expansive mind, and with a biting tongue, very critical. And he also said some extreme things. I don't want to mention them here that were unfortunate, but one of the most important things that he said was that in 1967, after the Six-Day War, not too long after the Six-Day War, he said the only option is to return all the territories. Because if we hold on to the territories, then we're going to wind up abusing the people, and then we will become occupiers, and it'll somehow pollute and offend. Somehow it'll pollute all of us.
Who said that, Chaim? Who said that? Yeah.
Yeshayahu Leibovitz. It's in this book, the book called Judaism, Human Values, and the Jewish State. Judaism, Human Values, and the Jewish State.
Thank you.
At Harvard University Press, and it's a collection of Leibovitz's articles translated, a small amount. Jerome is showing it on screen. I'll just say a very small percentage of his writings and of his collected teachings. So Leibovitz said as follows, very important. The state as such has no religious value. All right, I mean, he's blunt, right? No state ever had. Political achievements, conquests, victories, none of these are religiously significant. Who restored the border of Israel from entering of Hamat to the Sea of the Arava and recovered Damascus and Hamat, which had belonged to Judah and Israel? Who did that? Who was the greatest of warriors and conquerors among the Israelites? The king Yerovam, son of Joash, who did that which was evil in the sight of God and departed not from all the sins of Yerovam, the son of Nevat. I mean, in other words, an evil king. He's the one who expanded the boundaries of Israel. This is not a divine, godly, religious achievement at all. It's a political achievement. What was the religious significance of these enormous conquests, about which we know only from the 2 verses of the Book of Kings, right? And so Leibovitz says, from the empirical religious point of view, from the standpoint of religious tradition, it was nil. Our sages of blessed memory. All right, enough. Last paragraph. I contend that it is not by accident. Listen to this. It's a good insight. That no festival or holiday commemorates the conquest of the land of Israel by Joshua, the son of Nun. And that no festival or holiday marks the conquest of Jerusalem by King David. No, we have no Jewish holiday, no religious holiday to celebrate the conquest of the land. In fact, the Rashbam, in his commentary, Rashi's grandson, says that Circus is the great holiday celebrating the entry into the land, because on Circus, we leave our homes, we go into exile. The way to celebrate the entry into the land, according to the Rashbam, is to go out of the land so that you have a perspective on what you have, and you don't think it, and you don't take it for granted, and you don't imagine that you're entitled. You're not entitled, it's a gift, right? What you have is a gift, and you have to see it as such, as a gift. Now, I would say that Leibovitz, in a way, it's getting late. All right, we still have a little bit of time. Leibovitz, in a way, is a more extreme formulation of a very early religious Zionist articulation, and that's, you'll find on page 2, on the bottom of page 2, by Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. Now, Rabbi Reines is a very important religious Zionist figure, unfortunately not well known. He was the founder of the Mizrahi. He created a yeshiva in Odessa where Bialik taught, and which was closed down because religious authorities felt that he introduced secular subjects. He was a pious. I mean, if you saw a picture of him, you'd understand he was an old world pious figure, a learned yeshiva graduate who saw beyond the traditional world to the needs of the Jewish people, and he understood the enterprise, the Zionist enterprise, and Herzl's attempt for what it was. And look what he writes, source number 2A, bottom of page 2. Anyone who thinks that the Zionist idea is related to redemption, to come at the end of days and to the coming of the Messiah, and therefore thinks that it negates and nullifies one of the pillars of our holy faith, are just wrong. There is nothing of Messianism within it. The whole idea, well, it's not a good translation, of Zionism and its establishment is just about the improvement of the situation of our suffering brothers. This, by the way, is basically what Leibovich's position was. Zionism is about the achievement of Jewish political independence to protect the Jews. In other words, the state functions in its normal function as an enterprise, as a framework within which the Jewish people are going to be saved. Not saved in a redemptive sense, but saved in a political sense. Given the fact that Jews have suffered from anti-Semitism throughout their history, and that Herzl, in fact, concluded that there's no longer the Enlightenment did not deliver on its promises, therefore the only possibility is a Jewish national home. And Reines, in his writings, I've collected his writings, and they're fascinating. In one of his other works, says the reason that we can follow this Zionism is that it's a political Zionism. It's historical. It's not redemptive. If Herzl were the Messiah, I wouldn't follow him. Interesting. I follow Herzl because I see that he's a successful political figure who uses his personality and his smarts to appeal to governments and raises the understanding, the propagandistic understanding of the importance of a Jewish state in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the nation. So Reines's analysis is that the reason that Zionism is itself a religious enterprise is because Judaism is in favor of saving Jews. And that's exactly what Leibovich says. Leibovich says the state of Israel is significant in terms of the fact that it provides a political framework for Jewish existence. And Jews can take historical responsibility to protect themselves and no longer rely on others. Those are the sort of the minimalist terms, it seems to me, of religious Zionism. Any comments? All right. Now, I wasn't satisfied with this. And I said, you know what? There's another type of religious Zionism. It would never call itself religious Zionism, but it was. And it is. And that's source number 4. And you'll see in a moment why I say so. It's Achad Ha'am's Zionism. Achad Ha'am, Ginsburg, was the great opponent of Herzl. He promoted what we call cultural and spiritual Zionism as against Herzl's political Zionism. And he said that before the Jewish people were to be redeemed or renewed, then Judaism has to be renewed. And that modernity requires a renewal of Judaism for the survival both of the Jewish people and of Judaism itself, a renewed Judaism. And in renewed Judaism, listen to this, it's on the supplements, source number 4 in the supplements. Achad Ha'am, a letter to the editor. I give this as an example, and then we'll conclude. Jews and blood. Mariana, here we come back to your question. Are there any greater opposites? This is how I concluded one of my first articles written years ago, and I was certain then that this was an innate idea, a primary assumption, whose truth no Jew would ever doubt. Indeed, this is after he had read or heard that a Jew killed an innocent Arab in the early 20th century. He says, indeed, what have we managed to salvage from the Churbans, from the destruction of the temple, if not the teaching of our prophets, which we took with us on the long road of exile, to illumine for us our darkened lives in foreign lands. Our blood has been spilled like water in all four corners of the earth over the course of thousands of years, but we have not spilled blood. We always remembered that the great moral Torah, which our ancestors had bequeathed to us, is the Torah of the future that we must guard and for which we must be prepared to give our lives until it becomes the possession of all humanity. And the animal within us ceases to rule the lives of individuals and of society. What's interesting, by the way, is that Rabbi Reines says that warfare is an animalistic behavior. I mean, he rejects all forms of warfare as something potentially sacred or religious. I mean, it's so interesting that he has such a reading. So he brings with him to the political Zionism a moralistic point of view that he draws from Jewish experience and a perspective on the nature of political rule and the downside, not the negative side of political rule. So this is what Aaaa Am says, all right? So in other words, we have a vision, we carry with us our Torah. In this way, our people live generation after generation in foreign lands among nations that live by the sword and for whom bloodshed was their daily activity. But we, the people who are pursued in every place, with all of our external humiliation, look with disgust at our neighbors whose hands were smeared with blood. And with the depth of our hearts, we knew that we don't know, that we don't now, nor will ever have a relationship to this savage existence, because in our hand, we guarded the great moral truth that in the future was to spread in all lands and bring about an end to the brutality, cruelty, and bloodshed of the world. Then we will all sit securely in our land and see with our own eyes the great victory, the victory of our moral Torah, for whose sake we were murdered over the course of thousands of years. And now, he says, now I hear that a Jew has killed an innocent Arab. Our generation has merited to see a semblance of the dawning of redemption, the return of our children to our land. Indeed, is the end when we will be a light unto the nations imminent? Now, what are we able to say if the aforementioned rumor is true? Aha, God, is this indeed the end? Is this indeed the objective that our ancestors aspired to attain and for whose sake suffered all of those indignities? Is this indeed the dream of the return to Zion that our people dreamed for thousands of years, that we will come to Zion and defile the land by shedding innocent blood and behaving just like everybody else? So Aaaa Am says, even though he pushes aside traditional Judaism, the values of Judaism have to live on in the land. The culture of Judaism has to live on. As you said before, its language, its calendar, but it's not just that, it's the inner life of the Jew that needs to live on. I've mentioned this before in my collection of posters. I have a poster marking the funeral of Chaim Nachman Bialik. The whole city of Tel Aviv closed down. The city closed down for a poet. The city understood that the hero of the new settlement in Israel was a poet, a cultural figure, a spiritual figure. That's what the renewal that was promised. That's the renewal that I see inklings of that renewal today in various sectors in Israeli society. In the music in Israel. Listen, I brought along with me a couple of examples. In the music of Yishai Ribo, I mentioned him before. I mean, listen to it, buy it, listen to it online. All right, a modern Israeli popular singer who sings with a spiritual tone. All right, it's evident in the Beit Knesset Yisraeli, in the Israeli synagogue that meets on the beach in the summers in Tel Aviv and in a hall during the winter. In the summer, 1,000 secular Israelis go to receive the Shabbos, Kabbalat Shabbat, with a siddur that has on facing pages traditional prayers and modern Israeli poetry. It's a renewal of the Jewish spirit in Israel in ways in which we haven't been able to replicate here. Every Friday afternoon in the summer months in Jerusalem, at the Tachana, at the train station, there's a service where Jews with kippot and without kippot before Shabbat, with music, sing and dance and welcome the Shabbat together. That's Aaaa Am. That's Zionism living with values. The Zionism that we heard today in the ceremony of the Israelis and Palestinians, That's the living tradition of the values of people who understand that we live here with others, and we have to find a way to live together and model that behavior possibly as opposed that others from which others can learn. We need to learn first before we think others are going to learn. But I can give you many examples of what I consider to be a type of spiritual, cultural revival going on in Israel. Not the least of which is, my Israeli home, the Hartman Institute, where there is a Beit Midrash, a rabbinic study hall that's ordaining Israeli rabbis. It's a fantastic program. One of the leaders of the program is a kibbutznik. He's a rabbi. If you looked at, he doesn't wear a yarmulke. He's a spiritual figure who's reflecting the values and the spirit of Judaism in his teachings. So that there are, and I can say there are seedlings. This is emerging in various circles. And my sense is that there are changes. It's not vast. It hasn't spread to the entire to the entire country. But I see that as a type of exemplification of the Achad Ha'amian view that sees the potential for renewal in the land of Israel that will hopefully not merely be an achievement, a cultural achievement, but also will have a political dimension. Let me conclude by reading for you the last source by Rav Shagar. It's in Hebrew, and it's about the Hatikva. And I can't think of any better way to end a talk about Israel than to end with a reflection on the Hatikva. What Rav Shagar says in a work called Kelim Shvurim, Broken Vessels, says that the memory of the past is the foundation of a solidarity with the present, with the sensitivity to the other. The fact that we remember that we were strangers in the land, that means that today, when we are in the land, that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, that we carry with us this obligation to extend ourselves, to love the stranger now that we are in our land. The Jew is commanded to remember the Exodus at all times. Even when we arrive in our land and arrive at redemption, we need to recall the suffering in Egypt, because the suffering in Egypt helps define the character and personality of the Jew living in renewed Israel. That's the tension. That's the dialectic, right? That's the way, that's the rich life. We don't abandon the past for the sake of a romance in some ultimate absolute. We carry the past with us. History lives with us because it helps us shape who we are and continue to understand what our obligations are. He says as follows: the shuddering, the chill that he feels when he sings Hatikva is accompanied by, not alone, by a deep and wondrous sense of our national anthem, the melancholic melody, which is so slow, which is so different. He says, compare it to the melody, the male military melodies of national melodies of other nations, like La Marseillaise, like the Star-Spangled Banner, for that matter. Like he says, the Egyptian national anthem, that are filled with power and strength. What's amazing is that the Hatikva is a song that describes the homeland from the perspective of exile, from the Hatikva of the yearning soul. The person singing the Hatikva is singing not in the land, outside the land, yearning for the land. This anthem is not the anthem of a people that's been redeemed, but of a people that is anticipating its redemption. And this anticipation, this hope, is eternalized in the time of redemption itself, meaning while we are in the state of Israel, we're singing a song as if we're outside of Israel, hoping to enter Israel. It means that we have a consciousness in Israel of the incompleteness of the project, of the tension between being home and not yet home, of the tension between our fulfillment as a nation and the need to pursue the fulfillment of our values, of the tension between being somehow in God's land and the expectation that we live with God's values. So as we enter into Yom HaAtzmaut, carry that with you. It's weighty, and we need to be able to bring this to bear on conversations that have to do with the meaning of Israel in contemporary Jewish life. And hopefully we'll be able to carry with us some hope for the future, that we're involved in a process, and the process could potentially lead to some reconciliation and fulfillment. Take care. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
Shalom.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Chaim. Yeshar
Thank you,
koach.
Special call.
Same to you.
Thank you,
Chaim.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you, Chaim.
Sameach, everyone.
Like
Chag
Bialik
Sameach.
says,
Hi, thank you, Chaim.
like
Thank
Bialik
you.
says, it will be a wonder. Zionism will be complete when there are horse thieves in the streets of Tel Aviv.
Yeah. All right. So we did that. And prostitutes. We got that.
Well,
We got that.
It's off the checklist.
We have no shortage.
We got it. We got that. We got that one.
Cairo,
Garbage
10
man.
years. We got it down. So, bye.
Thank you, Chaim. Have a good night.
Night.
Call this stuff.